looking for someone. I guess I'm doing that.
Well, I think with Trespass is that we kind of feel is really the first kind of proper Genesis album. The first, the Genesis Revelation stuff was songs we'd kind of written with the original intention of other people doing them, and no one else would do them, and then we sort of modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and then just recorded them while we almost just left school. Very simple. We never played live or anything, and we just I played mainly piano on it and stuff. By the time we did Trespass, we'd been playing on the road for a few months, and we had a whole, obviously about an hour and a half's worth of material, and we just recorded what we thought were the sort of better ones for Trespass.
From the beginning, we set out as songwriters, and we were sort of quite happy to be writing what were effectively pop songs. But I think there was always inside of us a yearning to explore, to push the boundaries, and to mix styles. And as we started to get a little more adventurous, it got too out of mainstream left field for Jonathan and for the publisher that we were working with then, Joe Roncaroni. And so we sort of parted ways at that point. And at the same time, we were rehearsing and I think building an identity and a sound. And Trespass was really the first opportunity we had to make a real album where we felt, we were in the driving seat, if you like. John Anthony was there as a producer, and he was a great sort of man for performance and getting the energy. But I think the sort of the style and the arrangements and the approach was all determined by us for the first time.
From Genesis to Revelation was kind of an album kind of embarked on in a very naive way, but with a huge amount of fun. But I think we always felt that we had a lot of say, despite Jonathan King obviously being the sort of head honcho. I don't think we sort of felt that we were not doing what we wanted to do. Conversely, with Trespass, I don't think we sort of felt suddenly kind of emancipated from some sort of odious yoke in a way, as if this is going to be completely different, because we had a producer, John Anthony. The material was very much dictated by what we'd done on the road. I think if I'm obviously speaking for myself, but I think I remember the feeling with the others that if we'd had more time, we would have actually gone back to some of the music that we'd jettisoned. Because, recorded music is different to live music, but the tendency then, having been on the road, the pressure of the schedule, was to do the music that you were touring with, particularly if it's complex, because there wasn't enough time to rehearse new stuff. And we jettisoned all this sort of, what you might call sort of more adult, progressive, from Genesis to Revelation acoustic music, because it had just died on the road.
I think in a way the Trespass album was our first album as a band, you know what I mean? Genesis to Revelation was really a bunch of kids in a holiday time, which is fine, and an amazing opportunity, but between that album and Trespass, we'd become a band. We'd done live concerts, we were on the road, we were gigging band, we'd played together, we'd done the cottage era. And I think really, it's a strange album in some ways. The first album we actually ever did, only album we actually did, where we played it live before we recorded it, which I wouldn't do again, funny enough. But it's the first album I think that we felt like a band.
I was 17 in 1967, and that was an amazing year to sort of be entering adulthood. I'd sneak out from school and go down to the Electric Garden in Covent Garden, this was basement club, and you'd see all these oil projections on the wall, and it was a third-year band, or all this psychedelia, really, that was just the Indica galleries. There was so much going on, IT and Oz magazines. There was this cultural explosion happening, and it was this sense that youth, for the very first time, was taking over the world, and hypnotizing, intoxicating, that every barrier was being smashed down. And so, in our small, little isolated cell, we definitely felt connected to that. I think me probably more than everybody else, but this sense of trying to do things in a new way, in a different way, and that was very important.
I think we were sort of influenced, obviously in the early days we were very influenced with the Beatles, Beach Boys, Kinks, all that sort of stuff, which produced, which are still sort of very, very influenced on us throughout our career. But by that time we'd heard groups like Family and the Procol Harum album, Shine On Brightly and Salty Dog, and Fairport Convention, and the way they were doing things interested us. It just showed slightly different approaches. You weren't trying to write hit songs, trying to sort of make music sort of do a little bit more than that, and this appealed to us. And the idea of having a bit more room to breathe, songs creeping up to sort of 7-8 minutes, just seemed a lot more exciting to us, and the idea of being able to develop.
People often liken us to, we were in that era of sort of Yes, ELP and stuff, and actually they were very different as they are to us. You listen to Stagnation and those sort of songs, it's an acoustic album, We were always about songs and a bit of playing, but the playing sort of came secondary to the songs, I think.
Fairport Convention influence and the acoustic guitars was quite a big thing. And Phillips and Mike, used to play these two guitars together, and they do a lot of interweaving sort of parts and the harmonies they created between them, which was very much a sort of part of early Genesis, and strong part of it actually, and certainly led to the start of what was probably the best song on this album, which is Stagnation, I think. Which is starts off as an acoustic thing, which was a little idea of Mike and Ant's, and then it developed by the whole group into a sort of a bigger piece. But it was a very, I think that was quite unique. In fact, no one else really sort of was quite doing that, but it did come from that sort of Fairport sort of roots, I think.
There's a paradox here, you see, because Tony was more from the sort of classical side, but loved pop. Peter was probably heading more towards soul, but the guys that were into the heavy stuff was Mike and I, because we've been in the schoolboy bands, doing Stones, Kinks, and Beatles, and a lot of the heavier bands, and we were the ones that were writing the sort of really sort of third-rate kind of blues riffs and stuff. And we were much less sophisticated to start with. I think what sorted Mike and I out was going to the 12 strings and finding a bit of refinement there. But we were introducing, when we started with this experiment of playing live, we were introducing some very third-rate. There was a song called Going Out to Get You, which we used to do, which had a pretty indifferent sort of kind of riffs. I loved all the heavy stuff. I don't think it's true to say that Peter was making us go in that direction. I think that Mike and I wanted to go down it, but it's a good thing we didn't early on, because we weren't very good at it, is the truth of it. When the sort of the songs were developed out of the more refined songs into a heavier element, then I think it had some originality. What Mike and I were bringing to start with was sort of late sort of Stones, kind of Paul Stones riffs and stuff.
The folk sound of it, I think, was definitely from Ant and Mike and this 12-string combination, and I think that was really quite innovative, and I loved it, and I think tried to encourage it from my point of view, because they do these things where they get a composite chord. I know this is getting technical here, but one guitar will be playing, one chord and another chord, and you'd read the final chord as a composite of the two. Very boring for most people, but the effect of that was to give us a sound that was, I think, quite unique. And early on we had one local paper who described us as folk blues mystical, and we were trying always, I think, to sort of, whether it was church music or whatever the influence, whatever the passion, to try and blend it. Nowadays that seems nothing special. Everyone takes whatever they want. But at that time, music was very segregated. And I remember sitting in some publisher's office, and I think it was a record company, and they were saying, no, you have to decide what you want to be, and then you're a folk group or you're a blues group or whatever. You can't try and cross all these borders and barriers. And I feel that's what I've been doing my entire musical career, is trying to, whenever someone puts up a barrier, I try and find a way through it.
Let's each other.
some of the songs there developed out of things that we'd written as in sort of the way we used to write, which is Ant and Mike writing together and Peter and I writing together. The Knife particularly was the thing Peter and I sort of put together, and then we kind of developed it in the studio. I'm looking for someone's like that as well. And then obviously things like Dusk and White Mountain on this album came more from the Ant and Mike side. Visions of Angels was a song that was left over from Genesis to Revelation, which we then developed and made a bit more of to make it into a big live song. So, I think we were starting to write as a group, but it's still some vestiges of the individual writing there. I mean, looking back on the album, I like, it's not... I think it was a pretty good, well, I call it first album, it's really a second album, I suppose, pretty good for where it comes in the thing. And I think Stagnation is great. And I'm probably looking for someone. The other songs on the album, don't quite do as much for me anymore as they once did, I mean, I always felt Dusk was a bit of a B track. It sounds okay. And White Mountain used to do that live, and that was quite nice live as well, quite atmospheric, but it was not, I don't think it's as strong as what was to come.
Because we'd played a song so long live, we went in the studio fairly inflexible. We'd found a sound, that's the way it stayed, you know what I mean? And it was in a way a little frustrating. The way we worked after that, we went in with the songs, having never played them live, so actually you could mess around with the sounds. You didn't quite know where you were going sonically. With that album, we defined how the parts went and the songs were. So in a way that was kind of a unique experience.
It was slightly more sophisticated recording than from Genesis to Revelation, but not a lot. 8-track, I think it was. Can't remember. I know that John Anthony wouldn't let anybody drop in. So I remember Mike had a bit of a classical guitar at the end of Stagnation about 6 minutes in. He had to sit there, listen to the whole track. And of course, by the time it got to this bit, he was so nervous that he fluffed it, start again. So it wasn't that sophisticated. But there were more tracks. I was able to double track a guitar solo, which would have been on the Knife. Oh, what a giveaway! Which would have been unheard of, from Genesis Revelation. There weren't the tracks. So yes, it was a bit more sophisticated, and it felt a bit more sort of big boys-ish up to a point.
It was a very rushed sort of thing. You went in there, you had a sort of day or two to do it, and it was quite quick thing. And I mean, I remember being quite nervous really doing, you didn't want to make any mistakes because, it wasn't the ability you have now of sort of going back and repairing and overdubbing and stuff. The whole band went in there and we all played it, and you went on and did a take until you got something that was halfway decent from all of you. Particularly the drums, because that was the one you really couldn't do anything about. Some of the other stuff you could, but it was... I just remember going in there and just playing the songs. Well, they were pretty well, we'd played them on the road, as I say, for a few months, and we were pretty much okay on them, I think, and we just played them pretty much as we'd done them on the road.
It was kind of pleasant because it wasn't too difficult because we knew exactly what we were going to do. It was nice sounds, nice crowd of people. John Anthony was really fun, very humorous, a lot of bad, filthy jokes and stuff all the time, which we were a bit sort of, but he was great, and so it was kind of, I think I just sort of coasted through it, really, to be honest. I went through it on autopilot, is the truth of it, actually. There were no arguments. There'd been so many arguments when we were writing. There was nothing to argue about, really, except the level of whether the organ was higher than the guitar or whatever. So, and John Anthony was in charge of that. So no, it was pretty pleasant, to be honest. But no, I mean, I think by that stage of it, I wouldn't say I definitely knew I was going, but I wouldn't say that I was really pretty much on autopilot, actually.
I could barely play bass on the first album. I mean, I wasn't much of a bass player. I'd been playing more guitar with Ant, and then, of course, obviously he's the lead player, so I had to play bass as well as acoustic guitar. I mean, I just think the initial period in Christmas Cottage, where we did that sort of 6 months in the country writing, that's when I felt the band formed as a proper unit. And so it made anything after that feel very different in a good way.
Here today, the red sky tells his tale, but the only listening eyes are mine.
Stagnation, that was a journey song, as I call it. That you didn't follow the normal verse, chorus sort of structures, but you went on through a series of landscapes, and I think right from the word go, that was something that interested me, and it continues to interest me in sort of stuff that I do. I mean, more often now with sort of film work than film soundtrack stuff, but I love that, and I think some of my favourite pieces of music are when I, as a listener, get taken into different worlds made out of sound, and if there are some things that you've not encountered before or blends that you haven't met before, then it pays off even better for me. So I think that's what we were aspiring to, and that's, I think, one of the tracks that did that, and I think that was probably one of the most band-composed tracks on the record.
The Stagnation developed out of a piece that we'd had rather pretentiously called The Movement, which we'd been rehearsing for sort of like for a long time before we played it on stage or anything. And it developed, this thing at one point was about 30 minutes long, and it sort of got condensed, and bits came and bits left. But the first bit stayed. So it was always a sort of key song for us.
It was really a sort of 2 12-string thing that Tony got in on very early, and it wasn't just right to say that, we did the sort of chordal basis and Tony just put solos on top. It was more than that. I think his sort of kind of cross rhythms and cross harmonies influenced the way that the 12-string harmony went. Again, it was fun because you had this feeling that maybe we're just going somewhere slightly differently to other people in a very natural way.
Peter used to play a lot of flute, really. It was nice for us to have an instrument. You must understand, in those days, obviously, keyboards meant just organ and piano, really. That's all there was. And I sort of got a fuzz piano going, piano through a fuzz box, which got some good sounds on it. But the flute, which Peter played, was a very strong thing. I mean, he wasn't a great flute player, and he would never say he was, but it was a lovely touch in there. And, and things like Stagnation, the melodies, the big melody at the end, the sort of riff that carries on and on, starts off as a flute thing. And it's a really nice thing, and it was a really nice quality to have in there, I think. Obviously later, once the sort of mellotrons and everything came in and synthesizers, we sort of, it went by the wayside. But it was, it also gave Pete something else to do when we were writing songs. I mean, he didn't just sort of sing, we were banging tambourines and the rest of it. Obviously sometimes it gets a bit frustrating, I think, for him, because he was a person who'd like to have had his hands on the keys quite a lot of the time, but I wouldn't let him, So he could play the flute, and then that would be a nice way of writing it. It would give one a sort of another dimension to the sound.
I just hated the idea of being just the singer, that as soon as the lyrics, which never got heard much because bad PA systems in those days, stopped, you were left with nothing to do musically. So you either had to prance around or get off stage or stand still. Whereas I wanted to, I was full of music. I wanted to play something. Tony was extraordinarily possessive about the keyboard. Flute, I'd done a bit of at school. I always liked the sound and a little bit of oboe. I was even worse oboe player, but it made a couple of good noises now and again. And then the bass drum was something physical, visceral that I could kick hard. And occasionally it was in time. So that was important to me, to be in the noise-making department as well as the singing.
Stagnation to the Knife is a great example of what we do. The contrasts are always how we create our music, in a sense. And that album, starting with Stagnation and then having the knife on it, which is our heaviest song, and a popular live song too.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
Well, The Knife was a very popular stage song. And we used to construct our set in those early days. One thing we used to start acoustic, and I used to play a lot of guitar. And it would start with the first 2 or 3 songs I'd play guitar on, and then with Stagnation would be the first sort of song that had anything else in it. And of course that song itself develops, starts off with just the guitars, and then the keyboards come in, and there's even an organ solo, and then the whole thing becomes drums and everything comes, and there's a big thing at the end. So, and then The Knife was the kind of final song in the set, and it always got the audience that they always loved it. It was that sort of the dum, chick, dum, rhythm, it was just sort of always even people who weren't sort of quite sure what we were on about, they heard that and their heads were all going. So it was a key song for us in those early days, and it became very much, I think, for that first sort of year or two we were touring, the key song, the trademark Genesis song.
I'll give you the names of those who must kill, all must die with their children, carry the heads to the palace of old, hang them high, let the blood flow.
Well, the knife used to be known as the Nice because we were big fans of the Nice, and I'd sat around. There was an energy. The Nice, people, not many people know much of their work nowadays, but it was what actually drew us into Tony Stratton Smith. And although Keith Emerson was associated with some of the sort of more extreme departures of prog rock on the keyboard, then it was a sort of hip underground band that Hendrix wanted to join. Now, people forget that, but they were amazing. It was powerful. It was sort of inventive, driving. I mean, maybe Soundgarden might be a sort of modern day, well, latter day reference. And obviously Emerson was a great performer. He used to sort of rock forward and back with the knife. And I was thinking, and there we would be, sitting on stools, twiddling away at 12 strings, and you'd think, where's the balls in this? Let's get something with a bit of energy and a bit of something a little dangerous. So we didn't have anything like that. So I started to try and write something that would have that energy, and that's really how things began. And then Tony added a section to it, and obviously the keyboard thing at the end. But I think it was the first sort of peak of a darker energy that we discovered, if you like.
Standing in a forest gazing.
That was a very early actual piano song from me, pre the first album, in fact. I mean, it was sort of in 1960, early in 68. I mean, I couldn't play the piano at all in a conventional way. I used to play with 3 fingers in my right hand, octaves there, and then I would cross over and play a tune there, which is very bizarre. And I think Tony thought I was an idiot, which would be understandable. But like a lot of idiots, sometimes you come up with something that's quite just a little bit different, and it has something, because I was helped by the fact that I was very limited. Sometimes too much skill isn't necessarily a good idea.
Visions of angels on a round, dance in the sky.
There was that sort of plodding sort of piano style that was very fashionable. The Beach Boys had done it a lot. Beatles were doing it a lot. Things like with a little help from my friends. That sort of plod rhythm. And so, that fitted well with my octave, da 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 da, that kind of thing. Which the middle section with Tony's keyboard, the chords, and all that sort of glory that it gave, it made so much difference to it. And obviously, it was actually a song that was quite well suited to being dramatised a bit. Both vocally and in Peter's performance, and with the organ. So I'm sure if it had worked on Genesis to Revelation, we would never have done it. So in fact, that was a nice consolation for it not working out, because I remember at the time I was rather heartbroken, because it was definitely my flagship song from Genesis to Revelation, and it got chucked off. I didn't argue about it, but I didn't know it was ever going to see the light of day. So yeah, that was a really nice bonus, and that was one of the few, it was the only one from that previous era that survived.
Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that.
That was another one that was sort of, felt like a song which I'd brought to the band, and the band had then extended, and it was a sort of soul-influenced piece. But it then went into this sort of folkier journey, and I really was pleased with that mixture.
Trying to find a needle in a haystack, chilly wind, you're piercing like a dagger, it hurts me so. There
was, it was fun to sing. I always liked to try and have, in the different voices I work within, to have a bluesy one, and that was more sort of soul influenced.
In peaceful shades of green.
Our relationship, obviously, with Peter was a very close friend of mine at school, and Ant and Mike were the same, and then we were coming together there. And obviously on this album we had John Mayhew as the drummer, who was the person who was actually our third drummer. Someone we picked up really through ads and stuff and everything, and we were sort of slowly getting some cohesion going, I think, between the five of us in that way. It was quite difficult for John, I think, because we'd all been to the the public school and behaved a certain kind of way, I think, which must have been very irritating to him, I'd have thought.
It was the summer of many drummers, many adverts, many auditions, people being picked up from stations, skullduggery, cloak and dagger stuff, who's going to tell him, and all that sort of stuff. It was awful, absolutely awful, because we loved John Silver, and John Silver decided to pack it up and go to the States for university. He didn't want to, give it a go. John Mayhew was older than this. He was more experienced, but I think it was from a different background, and he was very unsure of himself with us. And I think we tried to do our best in our own rather lame way to make him feel comfortable, but I'm not sure we ever did. And he was a good drummer, but we were very demanding, very, very demanding. And I think he always felt he came up short. He didn't really. He did a fine job. The trouble is, the history hasn't treated John well, because his successor happens just to have been one of the very, very special drummers. He not only was a drummer, but a singer and all the rest of it. Brilliant musician. So I think, had they found a sort of more prosaic drummer afterwards, then history would speak more kindly about John. But he's cast in a rather dim light, which I always think is rather unfair. I think that we were pushing boundaries and trying to do this and probably being very demanding. And we'd spoken the same musical language. We'd grown up in the same environment for a long time. There's no way John could really understand what these toffs were on about most of the time. And I think he did a pretty decent job. It just wasn't clearly quite good enough.
We were used to sort of having this passive-aggressive tone to the rehearsals, because although Tony and I were best friends, we would be at loggerheads very often about the music.
It was very close, but we used to fight an awful lot, terrible arguments and shouting matches and going off. I was probably the main instigator of that kind of stuff.
He was then a lot more nervous and not at ease within himself. He would try and, in a tight way, hold on to controlling as much as he could in a lot of ways. And I would always want to push it wide open and, let the sunlight in and the rain and see what grew. And Ant and Mike, for the most part, got on pretty well, and occasionally, I would be in battling out with one of them, but Mike tended to avoid confrontation. And then, in later years, Phil and Steve would avoid the confrontation. But I think, Tony and I were the most frequently at odds.
We argued a lot because we were passionate. Also, we were young. Sexually frustrated, I don't know, all sorts of reasons we would. It was just one of those things. We did feel intensely about it, really, and you find yourself, you look back on some of the arguments you had were just about sort of pretty trivial things. But when you're close to people like that and you're living on top of each other, little things can trigger an argument. It's just about nothing at all. And that's first, the cottage period when we were just all living together, we weren't even hardly taking weekends off or anything. It was quite a strain on those people who did actually have relationships. So it was kind of, it was difficult, but it was intense. But it had some great moments there too, and I remember it, being as a sort of mixed period, really, some great moments and some violent moments.
No, we were passionate without question about getting something great. But I think, we were both awkward buggers, difficult sorts. So it was some of that personality as well.
It was a difficult period. There were some great moments and some awful moments, to be honest, during the writing period of this and everything. But then once we started playing on the road, it got a bit, once you started an audience response, it all started to sort of, make sense a little bit, really.
And my parents, bless them, are supportive. I mean, if you see your children really keen to do something, I think you have to support it. I'm sure they're hoping it wouldn't last, I'd grow out of it. But because in all fairness, in those days, as parents, there was no possible conception that you could have a career making this kind of music, pop music. They hadn't really seen that. And so, in a sense, supporting, I think that they were very good and very brave in that way, I think.
There was parental pressure, and in fact, John Silver, who'd been the drummer after Chris Stewart, and is a wonderful guy, and had, as was Chris, but John had actually been very good at encouraging us to develop sort of an individual personality and to push the folk thing. I mean, he was a sort of jazz fan, really, in lots of ways. And he dropped out definitely because of parental pressure. And he ended up, at Cornell University in America. And he said afterwards he was sort of still hoping he'd get the letter welcoming him or inviting him back. Whereas we just thought, okay, well, that's what he's decided to do. Fair enough, he's off. And with John was much more of a professional musician who'd actually played with real bands of musicians rather than a bunch of songwriters, pretending to be a group. And so he had sort of different sets of experiences, and I think he was having a difficult period in that time, and he worked really hard and was very dedicated and delivered, I think, well in some places, but it still felt a bit of a struggle. Just on the drum side of it, I mean, Ant was the other person who was also drum sensitive, so I think he and I sort of overlapped in some of those areas, but between us, we would have a lot of ideas for what the drum parts should do, in much the same way that I think, Paul McCartney did with Ringo. And obviously as soon as Phil came along, that role was unnecessary.
I went to university for a year, in fact, and then sort of took a year off and then took another year off. And I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. And I knew that I felt this was an opportunity that would only come. It wasn't that you get opportunities, it was one that was there. And I thought about not doing it, and then I thought I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this as a chance, and at that time it was an incredibly slim chance, as you must understand. And so we just sort of slowly, we were able to do it. I think back in that period of time, 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and things you could play where a band like us could just play support probably to some other group, in front of maybe 80, 90 people, maybe less or less, When we headlined, we were playing to sort of, sometimes a little sort of 5 or 6 people. I mean, that's what you were doing, But you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could actually, you just about could get enough money to keep yourself going.
Many people have been puzzled how the hell we did so well and how the hell we survived for so long, when in a lot of critics' eyes, the music is unlistenable. So, and I actually think that it's because it's based on songwriters, and obviously we built a very strong fan base playing live, and I think it was those two things. But if you look at, say, Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, 10cc, other bands which are songwriter-based rather than musician-based, I think you do see sort of long lifespans, maybe, or not at all in the same direction, but it's a different sensibility. Most bands begin, playing together and then find writing, whereas we wanted to write and we found playing.
Dawn saw the white mountain tinted with red.
People never realised that in a way, I think, apart from Peter, who was always very get up and go with agents and managers and the business side, in many ways that first era, Ant was the strongest driving force. Extrovert on stage, musically he was very strong, I think. So the concept that he might leave was probably nowhere near in our thoughts at all.
In many ways, Ant was the most musically gifted, I think, of all of us, and it was, I think, a great loss when he didn't sort of continue on beyond that. I mean, it was he was also the most obsessive, I think, in a lot of ways, and some of that culture, I think, grew quite unhealthy. That a life was not a concept that the band would sort of consider or allow beyond what we were doing. It was a bit like joining the army, and it wasn't really from an authoritarian sort of point of view. There was just this really powerful group mentality that it had to be 100% total commitment, and that, I think, also has its cost. And although I think Ant was very uncomfortable playing live, and that was part of it, but it was also, I think, extremely stressful, and in part it was self-imposed and then group-imposed stress.
Anthony, for me, was kind of the group leader. He was the one who wanted to go live. He was the one who wanted to go professional. He kind of motivated the rest of us really to do that. Peter and I were not sure at all that's what we really wanted to do, but he was the one who wanted to do it. And initially, I think we almost stayed. The first summer we started doing this. We did it because we were a four, and we sort of did it before with the intention that we probably wouldn't stay and they'd find somebody else. And then of course we got more into it and everything after that. So we were very surprised. Then Anthony was the one who sort of seemed to suffer from stage fright and everything, and that kind of, in a sense, was sort of perhaps ultimately the reason why he left. But there was no feeling that he was going to leave at this point. So it was a very sort of difficult thing. And I mean, at this point, we were very definitely looking ahead, for that this was the group.
Well, that was nothing to do with the music. It was just to do with the sort of stage fright and sort of things that just health, really. I just had kind of, found it really tough. I'd started well and then come unstuck, really. That's why I was saying, on the album I was pretty much sort of on autopilot, because these things had already happened. So the recording, in a sense, was quite pleasant for me because there was no sort of huge pressure. Because I'd sort of internally put myself under huge pressure on the road. I mean, you might have thought that being in Trident Studios was a huge, but I didn't sort of see it that way. It was kind of very pleasant. No, that was all to do. It wasn't. There was nothing. There was no sort of kind of left for musical differences or huge personality clashes. No, I just found the touring just had taken a huge kind of toll, really.
I'm conscious now, having just finished this book we've done, and hearing his side of things, I was kind of saddened that I didn't quite clock what was going on. We were very close, Ant and I. And I think at this stage I had a girlfriend and we saw each other less, and I kind of drifted away a bit. And I wasn't really aware just quite how bad his stage fright was, and he had glandular fever. I know he was run down and everything, but I'd have thought that I'd know him so well, I would have really been able to get picked up what was going on. But I often miss things. But I didn't, so in a sense it was a shock when he told us. In those days, for the first 2 or 3 albums, we had Paul Whitehead, who was a good artist who kind of, at the time, was involved in doing album covers and stuff. And so and also there's that nice gatefold sleeve you don't have anymore. So you kind of let him go. I mean, you let someone go away and do something quite that excites them, and then see what you got. And he looked great with the big sort of knife slash across, I thought.
Well, that was quite a nice idea. We saw the music we'd done. A lot of it was very sort of pretty and romantic music. We had this one song, The Knife, which was anything but, a sort of violent song. So we just pictorially did that. We said to this guy, just draw a fairy drawing and then knife slash through the middle with a knife sticking out the end of it. And that was sort of, I think it's quite good really, because it's deceptive, Genesis, sometimes. You sort of see them as one thing, but in fact there's this other thing going on right from the early days, I think. And we've always had those two sides to us, sort of, it may vary a little bit really as to how you define them, but the sort of romantic side and the sort of more aggressive side, it's a very important part of what we do. And so I thought that particular cover actually was really good, because it was it was supposed to be a kind of like a cliched sort of fairy story kind of like cover, and then with this knife on it, which did something special, I think. Best of the early covers, I think, in many ways. Well, best of the first 3 covers, anyhow. We
talked to Paul at some length, and and he heard some of this sort of folky stuff and mythical bits, and I just felt it was getting too twee, so I suggested that we get a big knife and slash it, which fortunately, there was a lot of discussion about this in the band, but in the end they went for it, and whereas I was going to go for quite a crude knife, I think Paul in the end chose this sort of more elegant dagger, which wasn't quite what I'd had in mind, but I think it did a job, and for fans, so I had again its own personality, which is what we wanted.
I think it seemed to be a pretty good compromise between the kind of folky sort of tendency towards slightly sort of medieval echoes of, and then there's the sort of harder edge stuff. So, and you want to draw someone's attention as well. So a great way of combining it is you've got one thing which is the sort of the characters plus this knife slash, which might look a bit OTT and grotesque to some people, but it seems to me to be a pretty good reflection. And you could see commercially why that was a good move.
Well, Trespass was a big advance for us from Genesis Revelation. We'd been playing live for a while, and I think it was the first album where we start to play as a group. We actually know what we're doing, and everything sort of starts to coalesce. Really, it's in its position in the Genesis thing, it was very important. It was a kind of because it set the trend, I think, of what was to come later. It's definitely the first of the Genesis albums as people came to know them, and from that point of view, it's very important. I think we still had a bit to learn, and I think one or two of the songs in there, perhaps a little bit slight in comparison with what was to come later. But at its strongest moments, which, as I said before, I think Stagnation, I think it's right up there.
I think it was a good start. There was definitely a personality that was different to other bands and prog bands at the time. So it was the first thing, I think, to set us apart. And we had, I think, some minor success in Belgium, which felt like conquering the world at the time.
I would think it's sort of a very good early Genesis album. Obviously, there's many better later.
I'd describe it as our first album as a proper band. That's how it felt. We'd become a band and made an album. We haven't heard it for 30 years or 20 years, so actually you go back and you kind of often reevaluate and go, well, that's really quite nice.
I think we wanted to develop it. I think we wanted to get more energy into it, more a darker feel too, and expand, if you like, the horizons of the musical world that we were living in. So things were beginning to work live, in one or two clubs around there, and I think Friars was a key one, and Angel Godalming, and then Newcastle, Glasgow. It was quite strange because, we seemed to get through in sort of southern Europe, and then tougher working class cities, and it was a sort of strange balance, and it was harder for us, in the sort of more cliquey, cultured world of London and some of the big cities.
Anthony Phillips left, and so we had to make the decision. I originally thought, when Anthony, as I said before, I think I saw him as group leader in many ways, certainly the most influential person in the group. And I thought when he left, we probably would split up, actually. And then we had a conversation. Mike and Pete were very keen to carry on, and Richard McPhail, who was our roadie but a good friend and a sort of a big fan and everything, said there's no way you must carry on. You've really got something going here. So all these things came together, and we had a meeting, and we decided that we probably felt we could do better on the drums. That we liked John and everything. He was good, but he wasn't. Just felt we could have someone more creative in the drum seat. So we had to make this decision, and so then we were just auditioning, for a guitarist and a drummer.
I stuck loads of ads in Melody Maker, which was the paper that was the most powerful at the time. Loads of bands were formed off the back pages of that. I think the odd Rolling Stone might have got a gig from that, or the odd member of Led Zeppelin. I think possibly the whole band like that. And it was 5 years of ads, and eventually this crazy guy called 𝗜ļ𝘁𝗶𝗶𝗄𝗃𝗄𝗃 phoned me up, and I figured he was at least as mad as I was.
Well, I saw the name constantly in the back pages of Melody Maker, you know, which always had the gigs that were on around town, or around sort of, you know, Greater London area, if you like. And they always seemed to be working. There was always them in Quintessence, I remember. And I remember complaining to my manager, or our manager, the band I was in, about, you know, why are they working, we ain't, because we hardly worked at all. And really, I just was aware, I wasn't aware of their music at all, because we were actually playing all the time, but we weren't actually gigging. Until one day there was an advert, because I was kind of losing the plot with the band I was in. So I used to scour the back pages as well for jobs, and there was one box, you know, advert with a box around, and Tony Stratton-Smith, who I knew very, very well. I had known him for years. And so I knew where to find him. I went to the Marquee Club bar and asked him if, you know, cut a long story short, he said it was for Genesis. And I thought, oh, at last I'll get to find out, you know, what the music's like.
We did quite a few auditions, and I think so. I took a big role in that as a sort of drum fanatic, and obviously without Anthony, who was the other drum fanatic, we put ads in, went through all sorts, and I remember Phil impressed me because I think he said he played on a George Harrison session, and I thought, oh, that was very impressive, but I think he'd actually done sort of third tambourine. But anyway, we had a lot of people, you know, including some, I think, really quite useful drummers. We did it at my parents' house, which is where Tony and I used to do a lot of writing, and we did some rehearsing. Mainly the rehearsals at that time, I think, were between my parents' house and Anthony's family's house. I suggested, I think, that we devise a series of tests, because we didn't have long in an audition. I hate auditions anyway, but one of the problems with John is he was quite, once he got something, he could do it and deliver it well, but he was a very slow learner. So when we wanted to try different arrangements, different grooves, different feels, it was a painful and really time-consuming process. So we thought, okay, we'll throw some different tests at these drummers and see how quickly people pick up these ideas. Phil arrived early, as he often does. He was the most punctual member of the band always, but he was there with his mate Ronnie, and listening to the two other drummers, I think, run through these tests. So by the time he sat down, he knew it. As an ex-drummer, or still a part-time drummer, I knew just from the way he sat down in the saddle that he knew exactly what he was doing, you know, just the way the body engages with the kit. It was clear that he could just lift the music. I think they always say a band is only as good as its drummer, and Phil is a great drummer.
The guitarist was more of a problem. In fact, we went out as a four-piece for about 2 or 3 months, I think, and which taught me a lot, because I ended up playing all the this piano I put through a fuzz box, that I played all the guitar parts that Ant had played, well, all ones I could anyhow, on that, at the same time as playing the organ part. So I was doing this two-handed stuff, which I hadn't never sort of really done before, but it made me mature as a musician, great amount. And although it was probably never great, the four-piece thing, we did get it so it wasn't too bad. And we started writing this, we did this piece, which became the musical box, which we started as a four-piece. And it sounded, you know, we knew this was really good. We used to play it on stage and stuff as a four-piece. It was good. We had a guitarist for very briefly, a guy called Mick Barnard, who came in. for a month or two, and he was actually good, but he just probably wasn't assertive enough, you know. And while that really wasn't working, we then, you know, we auditioned Steve. Peter and I actually went to audition him because Mike was having trouble finding. He was always looking for someone to replace Ant, I think, which he was never going to be able to do because he was a good friend and everything. So we said, right, we'll find a guitarist. So we went and auditioned Steve, and we were really impressed with him. We really liked the way he approached things. It was just different. It wasn't entirely the same as us, but he played these things. His brother playing flute and him playing these things on guitar, which were quite slightly more classical style, perhaps, than we were used to. But we just thought he had a lot of imaginative ideas, and he didn't want to be a sort of mad guitarist. We weren't looking for... Most guitarists either wanted to be lead guitarists, you know, sort of teeth, you know, or else they were just purely acoustic guitarists, and weren't interested in either of those extremes. We wanted someone who could cover both ends. So Steve was a very important addition.
Away from me, cold-blooded woman, your thirst is not mine.
Well, what was great was that we were all a bit serious, you know, and Phil was such as drummers should be, was the joker. He brought this lightness to the band. I know you got a shock when we first started rehearsing at the Maltings, because suddenly, you know, we had these huge rows, and Tony would stomp out, or I'd stomp out for 10 minutes, and he was a bit like, what's going on, you know? And I remember he stayed in my house, my mum and dad, for the first sort of 10 days rehearsing for our first writing period. This is before Steve, but musical box time. And then after sort of 2 weeks, he went to stay with Pete. So you get to know him a bit, you know. And I think he always thought that actually I didn't like him. I'd kicked him out and sent him off. You know, it wasn't that way at all. It was just like sort of sharing him, being around so you get to know him. So it must have been a funny time, the initial bit as a four-piece for Phil, but he just loved drumming and it was sounding good.
And the drummer's role has always been, really, you know, the guy who sits there is a bit overweight, farts, drinks too much, you know, cracks the odd joke, and deflates the tension, you know. That's really what our role is.
It could go from a blazing row to someone sitting down playing the most exquisite, gentle music, and I just think, wow.
It's just extraordinary that we have got on so great, you know, because at the beginning we were from totally different backgrounds, you know. I mean, I was a grammar school boy, but I actually had just come from 2 or 3 years at drama school where anything went, you know. I mean, I went out with all the girls, you know, whereas they come from public school where there were no girls. And, you know, I kind of was very light-hearted and jokey and fully comfortable on a stage, if you like, even though I was behind the drums. And they kind of seemed quite, you know, uptight. And again, part of that was because Anthony had left as well, and they didn't really know what was going to happen. You know, I mean, he was a quarter of the writing, team. You know, so you know, we'd be playing, and suddenly, I don't know, we'd stop playing, and something would happen, and then suddenly there'd be 3 of us, and because we didn't have Steve at that point, and I'd say, wait, what's happened to Mike? He's gone. You know, or Tony, you know, what's happened to Tony? He'll be back in a little while. A couple of hours later, Tony would come back, because something had been said by somebody, and I had noticed it, and very sort of lot of tension. So, you know, eventually, I mean, it took a long time for that to be gotten used to, and also a long time for it to sort of disappear slightly.
Well, Phil and Steve's contribution, particularly at this stage, I think, was to bring a bit of musicianship into the group. I think, you know, Mike and I, well, I mean, I was still learning very much as a musician. I mean, I was, you know, it was okay, but nothing brilliant. And Mike was certainly still finding his way, I think, as a musician. Whereas Phil was he was a really high quality drummer right from the word go. He's got a great, brilliant sense of rhythm. And Steve, obviously, he was technically a better player than than we were at that time, I think. And that's what it really gave us, a bit of that sort of, you know, ability to sort of bit of technique in there as well as everything else. Gave us a better chance to do things. I mean, for me, the contribution from Phil on the drums is what transforms it, really. And you particularly coming back to them and remixing them, just suddenly everything has a sort of lilt. It works in a way that it didn't. It was a bit stiff on Trespass, some of those things. And you listen on Nursery Cryme, and even there's those sort of complicated songs like the Giant Hogweed, you know, just they sort of have a much better flow about them, I think, for that reason. And Phil's other contribution, obviously, which we were aware right from the word go, was the fact that he could sing. The rest of us sort of made vague attempts at doing backing harmonies, which were okay. But with Phil, we actually had someone who had a really strong voice as well. So, and Phil and Pete used to do quite a lot of stuff singing in unison as well as stuff in the harmony work. And Phil was also very good at just picking out little harmonies, you know, sort of a la sort of Crosby, Stills and Nash and things like that. Just little ideas would come to him like that. So they weren't contributing much as writers at this stage, either of them. But it was very much more as musicians, which in a way we were quite happy with because we had quite enough material.
Phil definitely just lifted the foundation of everything, just with great grooves, and I think everything could be done better in some ways, but and I think Steve, it was colouring. You know, he was a colouring agent in lots of ways. You know, and it was this sort of dark, contained personality that was struggling to get out. You know, I think that's partly why we connected with people, I think, was that there was this yearning, longing build-up of some compressed energy that needed to explode and get out. And we didn't always get it out, but people could feel and touch the sort of vibrations humming beneath the surface. And Steve definitely had a good dollop of unfulfilled frustrations, I think, that gave it a good personality.
I heard the old man tell his tale.
Writing Nursery Cryme, we got together in Tony Stratton Smith's house and put all these and just started writing really and pooling ideas and things. And it was easier writing, say, than it was in Trespass, but it still wasn't that easy, I suppose.
We'd never really worked, well, they'd never really worked with us. You know, we tried writing stuff. We were doing loads of gigs at the time, and, you know, the odd day spent in a windy church hall trying to write songs together just wasn't working, so we had to take time off. So we pulled out of gigs for the entire summer of 71. I seem to recall it was 3 months, which was unheard of in those days for them, you know, working band. But it was great because suddenly it was a chance to work with a band, you know, to a professional standard. I'd never really made an album like that. I'd done an album once before with a band called Quiet World, but that was very much sort of don't give up your day job, you know. And it was great working with everybody. We'd just bought a new Mellotron. And it was just fantastic, you know. I had a new Les Paul that I got courtesy of the band, a high watt stack. Lovely, you know. Felt very, very nice. And I practically never spent a night away from home. So suddenly I'm 3 months with these guys who are all talking the same sort of language. A kind of, it was almost as if the band had their own kind of way of communicating. I guess, you know, the fact they'd been at school for all those years. I mean, it was a little bit hard when I first joined. I didn't really understand what they were talking about. They had it was almost like the equivalent of Cockney rhyming slang. And Mike, for instance, and Tony, chord shapes on guitars, they would say, "Oh, that's a nice guy. That's nice." And I'd never heard that expression. They had their own world of Genesis even then.
It wasn't an easy writing session. I don't remember it being like that. But then, fair enough, you know, you got new people for the first time. But looking back, it's got a strong character.
I was much more of a player, you know, and you give me a bit of music and I'll play it, kind of thing. I wasn't really writing, apart from a few lines of Harold the Barrel, probably with Pete, and For Absent Friends. I mean, you know, it's just difficult, you know, because it's one of these things where you never know what helped the bit. We were playing an awful lot together to write, a lot of jamming. as we've continued to do throughout the years. But I wasn't actually a bona fide writer.
I think it started with Ant, actually. Ant and I think. I'm sure it did, playing 12-string stuff together. And I had this Rickenbacker guitar. I tuned the strings. I started doing weird tunings. And this is a very bizarre tuning with it. All the top 3 strings tuned to F sharp, which is just mad. But it made that jangly sound. And it meant that big chord later on when you go bum bum, had this lovely open stringed feeling. And in fact, it's interesting because in a sense we were trying to work as a 4-piece and it wasn't really working. Tony doing all the lead parts on fuzz piano, you know. But actually, funnily enough, this song was the first time I felt that I actually did work as a 4-piece. The sound we made, I'm playing pedals at the end and Tony's playing keyboards, and it's funny, this song I think, I mean, had we gone the 4-piece route, this song might have been where we might have gone. No, it didn't. But in a sense, this song worked well on stage as a 4-piece.
Play me my song.
The first thing I noticed was that no one was actually making the sound of a musical box, and I thought, God, you know, here's an opportunity for me. So I did this thing, recorded at half speed, which was a little guitar lick going. And so that was, you know, my chance to be the Sugar Plum Fairy, perhaps.
Mike started off with the first dring, ding, dring, 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 and you know, I was a big fan of The Who too, and I really wanted to try and persuade Mike to find something, you know, like a little Townsend arm-waving, you know, ballsy attacking section that we could add in there. And I think I was pushing very hard for that, and it was in the rooms in West Hampstead on the 28 bus route. And it was, I think, exciting when that sort of first came to gel as a piece. And I think my head at the time also was in this Victoriana world, which I pictured around the house my dad had grown up in. And so this sort of controlled English mental landscape under which festered, you know, violence and sex was the sort of flavour that I was trying to bring in to the lyrics and vocals.
And I want, and I feel, and I know, and I touch.
I think it created that sort of fantasy, the lyric relating, you know, to all this sort of the old Victorian kind of quality it has, and the album cover, which related obviously to that as well. It was a very atmospheric piece, and it was musically interesting, and it went through all these changes and stuff. It was a sort of precursor, perhaps, of what was to come later. You know, you have the little bits, and not a lack of repetition in the song. You can start off with one bit, which is a very strong section, that opening part, but it never comes back again, you know. And we used to quite like doing that. We used to just like using a bit once and then going to a very loud bit and then a very quiet bit and another loud bit and then a sort of serene bit. And by using the contrasts, I think it's a sort of song that has about a lot of contrasts in it, which, you know, again, is for some people is very appealing, and some people just find it irritating because it means it never settles into a groove. You know, just sort of you're doing one thing, oh, this is great, it's stopped again, they're going off, time change and everything. But so it is a very sort of typical Genesis song, sort of that. It followed on from Stagnation, I suppose, you know, that same kind of thing, but perhaps a little bit more dramatic.
I never saw Family, the group Family, but there was a thing that they used to do called the Weaver, I think, which was a ding digga ding digga ding digga 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 ding, you know, kind of a rolling thing, and I had a pretty good foot, you know, so I could do ding digga ding, bum dida bum dida bum dida bum, and they kind of liked that. And so I put that with their rhythm, and suddenly we was like, well, hey, we're off, you know.
You see, there we are, we're kind of going acoustic, but going more electric. You know, it starts soft, and it builds and builds and builds. By the end, it's just, everything's going, you know. It's as big as any song we've ever done, really, I think. And I guess probably this must be the first time with the bass pedals. Because Trespass was a 5-piece, so you didn't need bass pedals, whereas we'd gone through that 4-piece scenario with Tony playing the lead parts and me trying to play rhythm guitar, guitar parts, and bass pedals at the same time. So in a sense, it's funny how things happen. You get stretched and you're forced into doing something. I'm sure if we hadn't been a 4-piece, I'd never have bothered to pick up the bloody bass pedals.
Musical Box obviously was, as I said, developed out of us playing as a 4-piece, and I think it also developed out of really right from the early days of the playing with Ant and Mike, and so it had that sort of 2-guitar thing, and I play guitar on it as well at the front, so the first part of it is all guitar, and we sort of, a few ideas came out of that. But I think the real strength of the song comes towards the end, really. This little sort of a bit that starts "She's a Lady," and then the organ comes in playing this little sort of fugue type thing, which I originally saw as instrumental, I have to say. I thought, it's really good, and then we did it. And then Pete suddenly, we were doing the vocals, and I said, oh, so he's finished now, and then suddenly he started singing on this bit, and I thought, shit, he's singing all over my bit. And I must admit, initially I wasn't too sure about doing that at all. And in fact, when we did the mix of the album, we mixed the voice too low. But on stage when we started playing this, I realised just how strong that was, because it was like what I played was still there in a sense, but the vocal just gave it that real sort of capping quality, I think, and it was a real standout moment on stage, I think.
Well, this was one of the regular battlegrounds, because Tony would, blissfully unaware of an audience, want to stretch things out for 10 or 20 minutes for big keyboard and instrumental things, and I would be thinking, well, we're trying to tell a story here too. We need to re-plug in back with some vocals. So I think there were a lot of arguments about those type of issues, and probably more in latter days too, in sort of Supper's Ready and like Apocalypse and 9/8 and some of the Lamb, because I just felt some of the keyboard solos were just going to were too long and going to lose people. So, and it was an important part, because once you didn't want all the up moments to be instrumental only and all the down moments to be the vocal bits. I certainly didn't.
Sunday at 6 when they closed both the gates, a widowed pair.
The first thing I ever sort of wrote in my own right for Genesis was For Absent Friends, and I think I was too shy to present it to the lead singer. I think, oh, Pete, do you fancy doing this? Because, Pete was very much the star, very open, friendly, approachable, etc. But at the same time, I think maybe the fact that we were the two new boys, Phil and I, we sort of wrote that thing together. We wrote the lyrics together. I came up with the music for it, and it was a pleasant little ditty. The thing is, a lot of people didn't realise that was Phil, because Phil and Pete did have very similar voices. In fact, I remember seeing them live before I joined the band, and I thought there was some sort of automatic double tracking effect going on with Pete's voice, and then as I looked a little closer, I could see that Pete and Phil were in perfect sync with similar sort of vocal tones.
Steve and I did write this song because we were the two new boys that kind of felt, well, why don't we sort of see what we can do? And the fact that it was on the album, I guess, was because it was very different from anything else, and I think we were quite happy to have that variety.
Any formation of the band has always been like anyone that could do something, could bring something to the table, singing, playing flute. We encourage it, you know what I mean? Whatever you've got, you use, I think Pete enjoyed having Phil singing it.
It's not my favourite moment, I have to say, but his voice sounds very nice, very pure. He sort of has more of a sort of James Taylor sort of quality in those days, right, before he got the rasp that was to come later. But it showed that he had it. I think because he had a nice voice, we thought it would be great to sort of feature it as a solo thing, and that was it. And Pete was quite happy with that, Just showed another side to the group, I think, a little bit, really. And, but as I said, it was more in the contributions, really, where he's singing, with Peter. I think that it's a more of a on Harold the Bower, for example, where they sing the whole thing as a duet, sing it together. In fact, they're actually mixed on the tape. You can't separate them. We thought it might be nice to sort of, because sometimes it sounds a little Phil biased, I think, that song.
I'm standing in a doorway on my main square, tension is mounting.
What happens is that my voice, as you can hear now, is has got quite a lot of bass content in it, low content. And the lower fills, on the other hand, is much sort of higher element, his sort of center of gravity, if you like, harmonically. So if you put the two at exactly the same level, you'll read more of his voice than mine. And even though Harold the Barrel, was all my song, that I think, you do hear just as much of Phil, if not more, in some places. I think when I left and that voice continued, that was easier for people to get used to, and he's a very natural singer, so I think it should have occurred to the others earlier on than it did, I think, to try Phil.
Harold the Barrel was a good fun song. It showed the kind of the humour that we would later, well, has always actually been in Genesis. People tend to take us very seriously, but we don't. So that was a good thing. Phantom of the Sound Masters was a huge stage song.
I had this piece that I'd written when I was at university, which is just this little organ part, really, quite a simple little rundown. And I started developing it once. We decided to buy a mellotron, that was it, because we loved the sound, and we had used a little bit on Trespass, and we loved the first Crimson album, which had used it obviously very extensively. So we went and bought one of the ones off King Crimson, actually. And I sort of, this little riff I'd started off at in university. I then tried it was using the mellotron and the organ, and it really developed these great big swells on this thing, and it sounded fantastic. And so that was Phantom of Sound Masters, and it was that we then developed from that sort of opening part into a complete song out of that, which was a lot of jamming from the rest of the group and everything. But it produced a very, I think, a sort of strongly romantic thing, a lyric, obviously, sort of based on the myth of Sound Masters.
Conquest, he found himself within a glade he'd not beheld before. Where are you, my father?
What I liked about that was the band had the kind of grand sweep of an orchestra on it. It was using the mellotron to the full. And I remember one night we were working on the song. It was about midnight, and we'd all had a meal. Normally we didn't do that. We tended to sort of down tools, and once the sun had gone down, that was usually it. But for some reason, we were all up for it, and we were rehearsing in this place in Crowborough, Tony Stratton Smith's cottage there, in a place we nicknamed Toad Hall. And it was midnight, and we were doing what became the end of that song. And I think we were all fairly relaxed after a few, drinks, and right at the end it just seemed like a perfect moment to do a guitar solo over it. So I steamed in with that, and I felt that there were no bands really around that were doing anything quite like that, a sort of fairly classical chord sequence and a rock guitar solo over the front that's maybe got a little bit more to do with the violin in spirit than the guitar. I'd come up with this idea of this guitar technique which was tapping. It was a 71, and it meant that you could play like a keyboard player by using the fretboard like a keyboard. Tapping's on Hogweed, it's on the front of Hogweed, and tapping's also on the musical box. So it's on both tracks, and also Tony and I used to twin these things together. So the intro of the Return of the Giant Hogweed was the two of us doing those parts in harmonies, triplets in harmonies.
Turn and run, nothing could stop them. Around every river and canal, their fire is growing.
taste changes over the years with all sorts of things, and but there was a mood which Paul nailed, I think, which although an external scene because of the croquet game and again the sort of suppressed violence was, I think, accurate for the vibe that we were trying to portray at the time.
It's certainly weird. It's as crazy as any wallpaper was that was around at the time, but you've got to remember that the 60s had just passed, only just, so I think it very much reflects its time.
I almost prefer this cover coming back to it than I did at the time, in a funny way, looking at it. It's difficult for me to see. It's so much part of my past and youth, and I've signed so many copies of these things that you sort of see them all the time now, so it's rather difficult to have an objective viewpoint. But I think it's a strong image, you know, and with the sort of the lawn stripes and everything, you know, it gives a very strong feeling, and it fits well with the idea of the title and that association with the musical box.
I remember at the time Paul Whitehead coming in with, you know, the idea, and obviously he had worked with Peter on a couple of ideas on the phone, I would imagine. You know, it was before the days of email, so if you wanted to see something, you had to actually get together in a room and look at it, you know. And the thing with the croquet with the heads, you know, that was all it's kind of off the wall. I mean, fortunately, it wasn't as romantic and feminine as Trespass, which was good because it showed that there was a little bit of a unusual side, not just a wistful side to the band. Because I think for Trespass, the music and the cover looked a bit wistful, even though there's a knife on it. But you know, it doesn't feel quite as butch as Nursery Cryme.
The flame still summer lingers on, though her picture soon shall.
Well, Nursery Cryme obviously was the album that incorporated Phil and Steve into the band, and I think that we became, for that reason, perhaps a better playing unit than we've been in the past, really. And we'd also, by this time, played quite a lot on stage, and so I think the development from Trespass was quite a big one. And we had the ability, the mellotron was a new instrument in that album and everything, and so a sort of certain quality of what people came to think of that early Genesis sound was very much, I think, started with this album, probably more than with the previous one.
I was thrilled with it, you know. I mean, the rough edges at that time I refused to hear. I just wanted to sort of bask in the glory of the fact that, you know, I'd done an album with what was destined to become a great band, and occasionally the sound was wonderful.
It was a real great 5-piece working unit, you know. I mean, we all got together for the meetings with the cover, you know, we all got together. We were there all the time for the mixing. Pretty much we were all involved in the writing, apart from the lyrics. You know, certain songs would have pairs going off to write lyrics. But no, it's the period especially. I have very fond memories of the period.
A step into the shade, if you like. There's more sort of sun shining in Trespass, more sort of folky fields and outside stuff, and we've gone indoors, a Nursery Cryme.
I think it's a good example of how we were moving on. It's got some nice stuff and some okay stuff, I think, at Nursery Cryme. Thought the cover was good. I like the cover. Actually, quite a strong image of the little girl on the croquet lawn and the head, I think. And we were starting to create an atmosphere about the band. You know what I mean? Quite as perception, quite slightly quirky. People seeing this artwork, hearing the songs, Pete's performance. I felt we're starting to sort of become something that was a little unique in the music business in England, and that was a good thing, I think.
I think Foxtrot was, we were gaining confidence. You know, live was going very well at that point, even though, you know, financially things weren't good, but there was a great rapport building, and it was beginning to sort of move around other countries, and so I think we were confident in a way that we hadn't been before, and so that gave us the, if you like, mental platform on which to build something like 𝗜ጵ𝘁𝗲𝗿𝘃𝗀𝗃, which is still one of the things that I like best looking backwards.
I think going to Foxtrot was, well, we were pretty confident in what we'd written and everything. I think it was, we had trouble with engineers and producers on this. I think 𝗜ጵ𝘁𝗁𝗏 were very keen for us to use this guy, Bob Potter, who'd worked with Lindisfarne. And because they wanted us to sound, I don't know what they wanted really, but they wanted the voice louder, I think was what they wanted more than anything else. And they thought a real producer coming in might be something, the sort of thing we had. So we went into the studio with this guy, Bob Potter, and I played, we started recording stuff, and I played the opening to Watch for the Skies. He said, I don't like that. I don't think we should use that. So I thought, oh God, here we go, And so in the end, I was no way. And we tried a couple of other things, and he was okay as an engineer and everything. It was fine. It was good engineer, actually, nothing wrong with that. But the fact he didn't like what we were doing meant that we couldn't work with him. So we got rid of him and ended up working with just the engineer. And in fact, we changed engineers in the middle of the song because the engineer we were working with, we weren't too sure about him either. We recorded the first half of 𝗜ጵ𝘁𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃 with this other engineer, and then we got this other guy, John Burns, came in as the next engineer, and we finished off the song with him and did the rest of the album with him.
Well, I was fairly shattered at that time, and we'd done a lot of touring, and I think every now and again I would threaten to leave, and so would Phil. And luckily, on day one of recording of Foxtrot, Mike and Tony sat me down and said, "We don't want you to leave, Steve. We really like your guitar playing." Now, strange as it seems, I hadn't really understood that at that point. I didn't, because, it was, I think there was a stiff upper lip thing in the band. We didn't sort of compliment each other very much. So I felt very insecure as one of the new boys, and I thought, I'd better to leave before I get sacked. But, this was a revelation to me. I think there was lots of great stuff on Foxtrot, so I'm pleased they asked me to stay.
From the way we worked, I guess, was, we were playing all the time, and we would rehearse. When we weren't playing, we would rehearse, and write. We tried to get blocks of writing time, but I can't remember whether we managed to do much more than a week in Woolwich and a week in Una Billings, or a week in... Some of it was done in Chessington. So we had a friend who had a house. So we moved in there to do a bit of it, I think. I know certainly Selling England was done there, but we did it all over the place. And we had moved on from Nursery Cryme. We were playing lots of gigs. We were very, very good live by this point. Obviously Steve had come on for the Nursery Cryme, but we were very much a band, a better band.
On the whole, this album is one that, is probably my favourite of the, as a totality of the early albums, I think. I just think it's got sort of, we really came of age of this album, I think, and it got to number 12 on the charts, which was a staggering thing for us. So we were quite excited by that.
In my mind, this is a much stronger album than Nursery Cryme, than the first one. I think it's, obviously 𝗜ጵ𝘁𝗁𝗏𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗃𝗀𝗃 is a huge piece, which we'll get onto. I think it was one of our best moments. But I think generally, it opens with that Watches the Sky sound, which I remember hearing Tony playing those chords sometimes on an Italian tour, one of these big sort of palace sports with echoes booming around. It sounded fantastic. The band's getting some darkness, I think, more so into the music. I look back and Watches the Sky. It's got a fantastic intro. The rhythm's great. I think the words are a bit suspect. They're kind of okay. Tony and I wrote them, but looking back, it's a little too busy. But I mean, I think that rhythm, bum-ba-da-bum-bum-bum-bum, was a nice sort of great groove under those chords.
Sadly now your thoughts turn to the stars. Where you've gone, you never can go.
Watcher of the Skies was a very important track to us, and although I think Tony was the sort of lead writer on that, with particularly the mellotron chords, and I did some work, I think, on on the verses and chorus, but the vibe was sci-fi meets prog, I think.
Seems funny to say it now, but I was still going to see Yes every Wednesday at the Marquee, and still trying to bring a little bit of that musicianship into the band, that they kind of tricky arrangements that they used to have, and I used to. So it's a shame we can't do stuff like that. So I think Watch of the Skies ended up. Certainly the intro was all Tony, of course, but that's that was kind of probably came from somewhere near my drum end.
I remember writing it with Tony Banks sitting on a roof initially. Outside a hotel bedroom window, there was a sort of tile roof, sat in there and looking at it, and there was no one around, sort of thing, sort of lunar landscape. It's not good to criticise things, which I often do, because these are period pieces, and as the years go by, I think I've learnt to, you can't just use the words you want to say, they've got to sing well. And these are interesting words, but they didn't sing very well. Watcher of the Sky, Watcher all. It's a stiff lyric. But a good musical song, yeah.
Walking across the sitting room, I turn the television off.
We always started each album, I did, with a degree of trepidation and excitement. A bit like, well, this is the new one, let's see what we got here, but I don't know, a bit like, will it be good, will it work, But I think albums in Mama seem to alternate. Nursery Cryme, I think, was a bit hard to write for me. Foxtrot was easy.
I think we were writing better together as a group. I mean, a lot of the stuff, individual, stuff was still there. You'd come into the group. I mean, I tend to remember on this album, you'd come in with ideas, a riff or something. And like I mentioned at the beginning of Supper's Ready, but also that applies to, what became the end section of Supper's Ready. It was another thing I'd written. In fact, the thing I'd written on guitar at university, as it turned out, the as sure as eggs is eggs thing. And so you had these sort of quite specific bits, like Willow Farmers, Peters and things, and we had these quite big just chunks that were all written by people. Kind of put them all in the same song, and then it was the kind of filling out stuff that almost ended up being the strongest stuff, though. Like the Apocalypse part, which was something that really was Mike, Phil, and I just wrote that, improvising, working out a big keyboard solo together, and a sort of way of playing it. So yes, I think we were writing well as a group together. And then the individual bits that came in, where we just developed them more. I was very free with them. Sometimes, in the early days, perhaps, with the song Timetable, for example, I came in with a complete piece and just said, right, this is it, and we did it. Whereas something like Get 'Em Up by Friday, I just had this riff, this dang, 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 dang thing, and played it to them, and then we sort of developed it as a group. And that was sort of, in a sense, was more interesting, I think, and that's why, So I think it both ways work, but I think they're slightly more interesting when the group can all feel they're involved in the composition. It tends to produce a better result.
I think Supper's Ready was, again, one of these journey songs where we really tried to take people along this dream journey. And when it worked and we got to the sort of New Jerusalem stuff at the end, you could really feel people, you were touching people in quite a deep way. And it was, there was a guy who'd been Edith Piaf's promoter in Paris, I remember. When he heard Supper's Ready for the first time, he invited us to perform it at his church in Normandy. And this was a guy who didn't normally relate to rock music. It was more the sort of Piaf era and tradition. And there were things like that were sort of growing in the music, that sometimes you get a feeling and get an area that you could harvest in different ways, and I think capture people's imagination.
We weren't quite sure what we'd written, really, until we heard it back, because we'd sort of heard this long thing. We decided we were really going to go for the long one this time, because we'd done Musical Box and Stagnation. I thought, well, let's just go for one whole side of an album, 26 minutes, and see what we can do. And we got these ideas. We actually sort of put bits and pieces in the thing. I mean, this song had started off just like Stagnation, really, in a way. I had this guitar piece I'd written, which we sort of I thought was a really strong opening part, which was kind of the first 2 or 3 minutes of the song was based on this part, and we started doing a thing on it and got the sort of melody and everything. It was sounding really good, and we're carrying on, and it was developing between little tinkly bits after that and all the rest of it, and a few vocal bits, and I thought that if we do this, could just be ending up sounding exactly like Musical Box. We're not careful, So I said, well, let's just stop the song. We had a really romantic bit. I said, let's just stop the song now and go straight into this other piece we have, which is Willow Farm, which is the thing that Peter had written. So let's just go in there. You've got this really pretty bit, and it's really ugly chord sequence suddenly coming in after that. It should sound great. And so we did that. And then that suddenly took the whole song to another dimension. Suddenly the drums were in, everything was going, and the second half of the song becomes very electric. And and I think produced what was our best piece of composition during the period with Peter, which was the latter part of Supper's Ready, particularly from the Apocalypse in 9/8 onwards. It was just, and it was a coincidence to some extent what happened there again. It was another of those places where I had this a keyboard solo, and it ended on these big chords, and I thought, yeah, just big chords, And I had this idea of just sort of vocal harmonies going, and then again Peter started singing on top of it, And I thought, oh shit, here he goes again, And I thought, when I heard it back, it really didn't take me very long this time. I thought, that sounds fantastic. And it really was the real peak, You sort of had this long build-up with this keyboard solo, which sort of like starts very sweet and then gets slightly more sinister, and then suddenly this big chord comes in, and then 666 comes in like that. Incredibly strong moment, I think. And I think for the early fans, it was the big moment. And on stage, it was tremendous. It was a really, really strong moment, I think. And Supper's Ready was... it needed all the stuff at the front. It's like foreplay. You had to have all that stuff at the front to get to that one moment, I think, and then from then on it kind of really delivers. So it was. I was very proud of that. When we first heard it back, having written it and recorded it, we hadn't heard it all back. We actually stuck it together. And Mike and I going to another studio because we ran out of studio time, and actually sticking these two parts together, which incidentally actually was slightly out of tune. So we had to do this sort of funny little slowed down the track in order to make it work, which we were able to rectify this on the remixes, obviously. And just hearing it back all as one thing, I thought, this is fantastic. This is so much the best thing we've ever done. I'm really excited by this. So that was a very strong moment. Funny because it's not kind of quoted as much as it used to be. I mean, back in the 70s, I remember they used to have these sort of polls. I remember on it was Nicky Horn's show on Capital Radio, and the number one sort of rock track of all time was Stairway to Heaven, inevitably, I suppose. But number two is Supper's Ready. Well, that wouldn't happen now. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because Supper's Ready never gets played because it's too long. No radio station is going to play a song that's 26 minutes long, is it really? So that applies even in England. So it's kind of it's not really known about much by people apart from people who know the group and like the group, and who bought the album, I suppose, and the live shows that we did with it. So it's a little bit forgotten, but I think it was a very strong moment. We were always tempted to try and do it on stage, but it is 26 minutes of a show, and that's an awful lot to give over to one piece from that period.
The big stuff on Supper's Ready, like the big instrumental stuff. I remember we were rehearsing at Una Billings' School of Dance in Shepherd's Bush, and I had something to do in the afternoon, and I came back, and Mike and Tony had written basically the Apocalypse in 9/8, and that's what it ended up being called. This was just this riff, don't, and I said, that sounds good. And Tony had written, not thinking about the time signature, he'd sort of written this keyboard thing, and actually the thing was in 9/8. So I maybe played it once or twice, but never really thought about it too much. And of course, we went in to record it, still not really knowing what it was, but it was just like one of those moments where the tape was playing and recording, and it was just captured. That's one of our best, probably one of our best spontaneous moments. I still listen to that and can't quite work out, how it just all happened at the right time. So. And also the last bit, New Jerusalem, I think that's fantastic. So that's probably my favourite song on that.
It's funny, looking back, the way it happened, it was never like you knew what you were doing. You know what I mean? We had a whole lot of bits, and then we sort of started stringing them together. And it's the first time it happened like this, the second half, the the sort of keyboard solo to the end, was really when it showed a bit more of a freedom. You know what I mean? The keyboard solo was just really myself, Phil, and Tony and Steve just sort of jamming, and Tony writing stuff over that riff we're just playing all the time down the bottom with no movement, so he can move around the chords a lot. But the moment when we built to that 666 bit was one of those few moments in your career where you actually got a great sounding thing, and Pete came in with it's a vocal line we hadn't sung together. He laid it on top. You hadn't been rehearsing it like that. He just came in, we imagined there was some singing there, or maybe not, and it sounded fantastic. I likened it to Mama. I think the middle eight of Mama and this bit have got similar things where just it's really one of those moments in your career where you go in and Peter first of all and Phil later had laid this vocal down. It's just like fantastic, you know, so strong. So it shows a bit more freedom, you know, because we tend to write songs much more compact, lots of bits in it, whereas this was a bit freer. You know, you'd stay on a section for a bit longer and let things happen.
He's writing the lyrics of a brand new tune.
What I've always loved about this business as a writer, and you learn it as you go along, is that there's luck. I mean, luck does come into it. And things that seem quite effortless, as this was, are always good. You know, we weren't aware when we put it all together that we had a really strong thing. Thought it was good. But things that happen without feeling you're trying are often the best things, I think. And I think someone really had that sort of feeling about it.
I think we were beginning to know who we were as writers and also know how to deliver it as performers. Whereas I think, it's a coming of age piece, I think, in lots of ways.
It functioned like the introduction to Supper's Ready because it just went straight into Supper's Ready, so people just assumed it was part of Supper's Ready. That's fine, but it was 1 minute 30 seconds of me coming up with something that was based on a Bach prelude, I think it was for cello, and I was amazed that the guys let me put it on the album. To be honest, I remember playing it to them in rehearsal one day, and Phil said, "It sounds like there ought to be applause at the end of it." So you know, I'm thank you, Phil, for that. You know, because otherwise perhaps it wouldn't have made it onto the album. It's very nice, you know. It's slightly sort of. I was thinking along the lines of Tudor composers like William Byrd, writing short pieces like the Earl of Salisbury, very short pieces, 1 minute 30 seconds, perfectly good enough for a Tudor composer, but for rock and roll, in those days, nobody told you that you couldn't.
Get 'em out by Friday. You don't get paid till the last one's well on his way.
Get 'Em Out by Friday was a song essentially about people being kicked out of rented accommodation. So there was, I think, some of the Rackman stories of sort of bad landlords and that sort of thing. And I put in a little extra thought there about evolving the species to shrink people, so that with genetic engineering you might make people a lot shorter, which would mean you could get many more apartments in the same building. And it was done, you know, as a sort of slight comment on attitudes of landlords to tenants. But there is actually, I think, a reasonable argument that when we are fully controlling our evolution genetically, which I think we will be, maybe not in my lifetime, but in my children's lifetime, there may be a decision to go smaller. I mean, that's one way of using less of nature's resources in all sorts of areas. So, get short might be a slogan of the future. Part social comment, part prophetic.
Going Out Friday is a good song, I think, actually. A little example of where, I mean, great lyric, nice idea. An example of where something we did suffer from, we had too much stuff on a song. You know what I mean? The track was great without any vocals. It sounded good, but in fact, when the vocals came on, there's a very clever lyric and a great performance from Peter. It's almost too much in there. As the years tick by, later on, 10 years down the line, we started to realise that there's a danger in actually not getting the voice early on when you're actually playing tracks, because in a sense, sometimes in those days we'd often do that track instrumentally. People would go away and come back with a lyric sometimes and vocal ideas, and hadn't sung much beforehand. Whereas, sometimes in the later songs you can just play the chord of A for 8 bars, which instrumentally sounds a bit boring. When there's a great vocal on top, it really works. So we sort of had more space later on to let the voice do its thing. And this song suffered a bit from having just too many good ideas in it.
Because there was nothing to sing at the time, Peter wouldn't necessarily sing. He'd be playing his bass drum, he'd be playing his tambourine, he'd be playing the flute, shouting something, singing something. We couldn't hear it because it was in the rehearsal room, not very good PA. And we'd get these great things that actually sounded like instrumental things. And then he would go away and come back with a lyric. And it would it'd be so crowded, so dense, and the idea was great, because this was the idea of running short of space and property, so let's try and get people to become smaller, I think it was kind of roughly the gist. But no, we did find that the downside to the way we were writing and the kind of just the technical hearing a voice at that stage meant that we would write these things and they would come back a little busy, a little dense, by which time it was too late. Because sometimes we'd recorded the backing tracks, and then we'd say, okay, well, you go and write the lyrics for that, you go and write the lyrics for that, and then the lyrics would come back, and we put a vocal on, and it was like, sometimes.
The second best song is definitely Get 'Em Out by Friday for me on this album. I mean, I think that's a much better song than Watch of the Sky. So the introduction is a sort of, is a kind of a bit of an iconic sort of piece, I suppose, with Genesis. But it's, people forget about the other ones. I mean, but I don't know. I know a lot of people who think Can You Sit It in the Coastline is one of their favourite tracks, So I think I think every piece on this worked pretty well. It's strong. I mean, the end section of Can You Sit It is really good. I think it's the first part's good. It's a really good song. And then it's just a bit fragmented, that song, I think. That's where it suffers slightly. But the last part is a good instrumental piece as well. So, I just said before, I feel this album is strong all the way through.
Skimming by as eyes of the past.
I was less happy with this sleeve than I was with the first two. I think the style was losing some of its appeal to me, even though the Fox character, I think worked. And then I'd had this sort of Fox idea of really, which was related to, I think, hunting and the hunted, and I was looking at all sorts of esoteric stuff, and numerology was one of the things that when I wrote out the letters, each letter carries a certain value, and A, B, C, D, E, F, and then next time you come round you get to O, and then you get to X, all of which are under the number 6. So then there was the Revelation references and 666 and all that crap. So there was a sort of hidden element to it, which we were just playing around with, really, and it wasn't the backwards playing devil worshipping version, but this mixture of sort of Christian and pagan symbolism was, I think, part of that journey.
When I first saw it, I thought, I wasn't sure about it, to be honest. If I'm honest, it looked rather like a kind of collage of unlikely things. It looked like a number of cutouts. Since then, I've come to understand the concept of collage a little more, and I think it works. But at the time, I thought this is just strange, and does it work? And it had this sort of flat, one-dimensional sort of look because it was collage, I suspect.
Well, I thought this was the weakest of the album covers he did, certainly at the time. I mean, you come back to it now again, it's rather difficult to view it as a sort of, objectively. I don't. The sort of the mockery of the hunt sort of thing, it seemed a bit of a cliche and everything. I didn't sort of think, and it was sort of his idea to kind of do it, to do what he did. And it doesn't really relate to anything on the album, So it was all a bit of a thing. But we managed to make it kind of make sense by giving the album the title Foxtrot. Sort of helped to kind of, to rationalise it a little bit. But I don't think we were terribly happy with it, to be honest. It was just one of those things that, as a group, we weren't that happy with. I know a lot of other people think it's good, but not so much for me.
Lovely atmosphere on Trespass and Nursery Cryme. They felt like paintings and had a nice texture. This felt a little bit... It was okay, but he just put together a bunch of images that were in the lyrics, in a sense. I think it didn't do it for me. I think it was a bit weak. And I guess that's why we changed the next one, I think, actually, time to move on, in a sense.
For me, it was like getting a little bit busy. And I guess that was one of the reasons why we felt, we didn't know that then, but that was the last one that Paul did for us. Because I just felt that, Trespass did have an elegance about it, and Nursery Cryme had more, more butch. But this was just a bit busy, it looked like it had been, didn't look professional for some reason. The fox's head lady, or a figure anyway, on a bit of ice, is it? And the water, it's all a bit dated now. But I mean, it does sum up the album, the period. You just sort of, straight away you're there. But what do I think? What did I think of it? I thought it was okay, but not particularly special.
I used to wear this UV makeup and bat wings, but it would start the show, and in darkness, the UV lights would slowly come on, and these big droning chords would appear out of nowhere, and then you'd see these two little points of light, which would be the eyes lit up, and we had a white backcloth at that time.
Well, Peter had started, as I said before, really trying to find things to do on stage, and she developed into wearing these kind of, the masks and everything, which on Supper's Ready worked really well. I mean, the flower idea was, at the time it seemed a bit crass, but it just worked so well, As I said, it happened at that point I was talking about in Supper's Ready, where the music went from pretty to silly, and he just sort of suddenly said a flower and stuck this thing on his face, and it was a great musical moment.
A flower?
If you go down to Willow Farm.
Paul Conroy, who was working with us as an agent, and apparently I think Glenn Coulson, were talking about ways of trying to market this record, and I think Paul got the music, but it wasn't really Glenn's cup of tea at all. But when they saw the cover and saw this fox character, they thought, oh, maybe we should, pay someone a few quid and have them wear a fox head, and then I thought, well, actually, if we're going to do that, I should try doing that. So I took a red dress from my wife's wardrobe, she told me since it was an Ossie Clark dress, it would probably be worth quite a lot now, and I could just about get into it. I put the fox head on, and the first gig was actually in this old boxing ring in Dublin, which, while now being a very progressive, tolerant, open city, at that point, there was a shocked silence when I walked out on stage, seeing a man in a dress and in a sort of animal head. There was a visceral sense of shock that you could feel, and I thought, oh, that's interesting, we'll do that a bit more.
Pete probably very clearly realised that if you try to run it by the band and get a committee vote on it, we'd all have said, you've got to be kidding, So he cleverly appeared on stage with a red dress and a fox's head. And we all kind of just went, wow.
There was a ton of arguments about it, and I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to do it. Because we were always doing this sort of band democracy stuff, and actually it wasn't a real democracy because some people were more powerful than others. And the more bloody-minded of us tended to get their way more often, as it is in every band the world over.
We realised, I mean, the story is that, we did it and we weren't sure about it. We were happy enough with it in a way, but the next week he was on the front page of Melody Maker, so we thought, this is interesting.
And at that point, the band said, maybe Peter has something. Perhaps we shouldn't fight him on all of this, because they definitely got front page good.
People often think it was the other way around, that the sort of thing he was depicted on the cover, but of course he just dressed up, which is funny in a way because we weren't too sure about that album cover. So but it sort of made sense when you only did it. Suddenly he dressed up, turning up like that. And I can't remember exactly what I thought at the time. Really, I mean, it was probably didn't approve to begin with, but then got used to the idea.
Hey, my baby, don't you know our love is true?
Foxtrot always appears to me to have an album where things took us by surprise, as in Supper's Ready, and the end section, And later on in our career, that happened a lot more. But in those days, there were 5 of us full of ideas. It was a little bit of a sort of almost too many ideas going around. So bits like this, where things could just happen a bit freer, I think were great.
Well, Foxtrot was the first album to sort of, I think, where we kind of sounded sort of convincing to the outside world. I think we sort of convinced ourselves with the first 2 albums and convinced maybe our fans. And I think Supper's Ready just took it on slightly another level, when people could hear this album who had never heard Genesis before and be interested in it. And I think that was a significant moment. And it was, as I said, it was a minor hit. I mean, it wasn't a big hit, but it certainly was sold a lot more than its predecessors had.
I would summarise the period as a band trying to find its feet, hoping that the record company were going to renew their contract each album, and we were being given the thumbs up to develop very, very slowly, thanks to Tony Stratton-Smith, who was a wonderful man who signed acts who he felt passionately about, and he would give them and us many, many albums to make it. It was a very slow burn in those days. It was, there was nothing meteoric about the rise of Genesis.
I was definitely getting to feel like a band, and I think Phil was certainly beginning to get more comfortable in terms of expressing himself musically, and Steve would be sort of would assert himself, but I mean, still slightly tentatively, I think. There was always a holding back element with Steve when I was there, and I think that loosened up, when he went from glasses to contact lenses.
I have very fond memories. We did most of it at Island Studios in Basing Street, and John Burns was the engineer, kind of helped us. And, hearing those things and hearing Supper's Ready put together, and it was very strong, We were actually getting somewhere, and here we had a great album. So, and this album, when it came out, did better than the one before. So it was all, power to the people.